Hutchinson, Kansas, Norman, Oklahoma, Auburn, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi, Fort Smith, Arkansas, Sioux City, Iowa. Suddenly, all of these places that typically don't worry much or at all about wildfires now need to be worrying about urban conflagrations.
I think historically, people have always thought of wildfires as being something that happened in California or Colorado. And we know that there's a huge fire risk in areas of the South. New Jersey's had fires, Oklahoma, large fires in Florida, and the Carolinas. This is not just a Western states problem. Anytime you have the perfect storm of conditions, you have the wind, you have low humidity, you can have these fires.
North American wildfires in the past 6 years seem to have hit a whole new level of destruction. They have burned thousands of homes, completely leveled communities, and killed hundreds of people. We haven't seen this kind of devastation from fires since the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when big urban fires ravaged cities like Chicago and San Francisco. And while we've called these fires in Colorado and California and Hawaii wildfires, they have burned homes. They have also defied the systems we've put in place to stop them. In fact, when they're burning, they seem unstoppable. At Headwaters, we've tried to pinpoint the communities at risk of these urban conflagrations, and many of them, surprisingly, are not in typically wildfire-prone areas. What's important to note, though, these fires are actively changing urban planning and firefighting, and that's what we want to explore today. I have several burning questions on this topic that I've been wanting to explore with Doug for a long time. For instance, are these conflagrations really wildfires? What makes them different from other big fires? And how do we stop them? And why does any of that matter for me as a planner or for you as a homeowner? So let's get into it. Doug, admittedly, this is a topic that I have been looking forward to picking your brain on for a while. I remember when the Marshall Fire in Colorado happened several years ago. It burned thousands of homes in a really suburban neighborhood outside of Boulder, Colorado. And it wasn't really near any dense forests or mountains. And I remember saying to myself, that's not a wildfire. And when the fires in LA happened in January, you were the first person to agree with me on this, that these massive urban fires aren't wildfires. And I think that's a pretty existential statement. If these aren't wildfires, then what are they? And what causes them? What stops them? We're going to get into the causes later in this discussion, but I want to start with the simple question of what these fires are. And I think you're a unique person to answer this because you are a wildfire expert and you were a structural firefighter in Oregon for 25 years and are really familiar with what it takes to save a home from a fire or a wildfire.
Well, thanks, Ryan. It's certainly not a simple question on what these are. I think historically, like you had said, we have called these urban conflagrations because, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with those great fires in the cities, that's what they were defined as. And as building codes and better construction techniques came around, we kind of quit using that term for a long time until the early 1990s, when these wildfires came into our cities, notably Southern California. And then this term kind of came back into usage again because there's really nothing else to define these. We've talked about them as urban wildfires, but as you said, they're not wildfires. And so the term urban conflagration has been used to really define any large uncontrollable fire that spreads rapidly through densely populated areas, usually causing widespread destruction. And so we use this term now, and it's not an easy term to say. It's confusing to define to the general public, but it's a term that has now been used to describe these fires like we're seeing recently in Lahaina and in LA, and like you said, the Marshall Fire, where we have these fires burning into urban areas that aren't wildfires.
You and I have been doing some work lately on how catastrophic fires, more than a century or 2 centuries ago, influenced modern building code standards. And as we've been doing this research, I found myself writing about these, great urban fires of the past as, things of the past. Like we're talking the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, which destroyed 3 miles of the city, and then like the 1906 San Francisco fire that came out of the earthquakes. And these things, as you said, used to happen when our cities were entirely made of wood or when we didn't know how to take certain measures to reduce our fire risk. And they happened before structural fire departments were a thing, before there were fire stations. I think for most of, early history in the United States, firefighters were purely volunteers in communities. So as I've been writing about these, century old fires, I began to realize that they are no longer things of the past. The Camp Fire in 2018 destroyed more than 14,000 homes. The Marshall Fire in 2021 destroyed more than 1,000. And the LA fires this year destroyed more than 11,000 structures, including many thousands of homes. So if these urban fires were a thing of the past, as you said, why have they come back? And why are they happening now?
Yeah, so you're right, Ryan. I mean, originally when we had these fires burning these cities, we realized that the way to stop them was to use different building techniques, adopt codes, require sprinkler systems, maybe have the cities not build their boardwalks out of wood. And so we were able to develop codes, come up with a science that allowed us to really stop those fires from destroying these huge urban areas. And now we're seeing fires in these urban areas again through a different cause, but similar situations, right? We have spent decades building in this wildland urban interface. We've built with building techniques that didn't really take into account fire. We built under codes that defined how we build if there was a single structure fire and how we're going to protect the neighborhoods from a single structure fire with, you know, the plenty of fire resources to attack that structure fire. But we never built, never designed streets, never designed the landscape codes to take into account these fires coming into these urban areas fueled by hurricane force winds that quickly overran fire department resources. And that's what we started to see in the 1990s. And like you said, have continued. So the solutions are the same, right? It's building differently, building infrastructure differently, looking at these as what they are. They're not wildfires anymore. These are, again, urban conflagrations, and we need to find solutions for these, knowing that they are not your traditional wildfire.
And so at Headwaters, we wanted to basically identify the specific causes of these urban conflagrations. So after the LA fires this January, we decided to use wildfire risk maps that we maintain with the US Forest Service to try to sort of predict other places where these types of conflagrations might happen. And so using these examples from fires in California and Colorado and Hawaii from the past 5 years, we found that these urban conflagrations share some common characteristics, which you just listed. They are fueled by hurricane force winds. They're in areas that have a lot of wildfire exposure, but they're also in areas where there's a certain density of homes and there's just a certain number of structures in the area. And after doing this analysis, we identified more than 1,000 communities across the country that are at risk of these conflagrations. And I think these fires are really different in some ways than we have actually seen before in the wildfire world. I know you said that we began to see things like this in the 1990s, but to me, these recent examples in the past 5 years feel different. They are different when it comes to how they burn and what they burn. They are different in how we fight them or try to fight them. And they are also, I think to me, most interestingly, they are different in terms of the consequences that they have in a community.
You're exactly right. And let's take that first question and dive into that a little bit, Ryan. They're different on where they burn. These fires are burning in places that aren't, in a lot of cases, near forests or open spaces. These fires are not being ignited from, let's say, lightning or coming in from a large tract of public land. The ignition source can be within or adjacent to urban areas. So they're burning in places we just haven't normally seen fires like this. The pattern of spread on these fires is something that has, I think, caught everyone off guard, being fueled by hurricane force winds, the ember transport, the way these fires burn quickly overruns fire department resources that are trying to protect them. Those fire departments are trying to get people out of the way. They do not have the capacity to fight these fires when they're burning this fast. And I think that one of the biggest differences is the primary fuel source in these fires. In wildfires, we understand how they burn. We've fought them for a long time. We understand the fuel source of trees and moisture content. And in wildland fires, it's a lot about containing that fire, flanking that fire, and we know how to do that. When it comes to these urban conflagrations, the primary fuel source tends to be man-made combustible material, right? It's not your traditional wildland fire vegetation fuel source. It's things like homes and sheds, fences, cars, boat, RVs, anything in that urban area that is a combustible fuel source. And not only do these burn really hot, but they also produce enormous amounts of really large embers that are then blown downwind, causing additional fires on anything they land on. So that then adds to that pattern of fire spread and how fast it overruns fire departments.
I think just to remind everyone what embers are, there's these basically when something burns, like when you watch a campfire burn, it spits out all these little sparks that fly everywhere. And homes are no different. When they're on fire, they're spitting out these embers, except they're spitting out like thousands and thousands of these embers that then can fly for, 2 miles or more and catch other things on fire. Here, I want to dive a little bit more into your background as a structural firefighter. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage a structure fire in a city? What you would typically do and how that is hard to do in the context of an urban conflagration.
Yeah, when we have a single structure fire, let's say in an urban area, fire departments know how to attack that fire. They have the resources to do it. Current building codes really help keep that fire in check. And if we have concerns at all about wind, we usually have the resources to make sure that fire doesn't spread to adjacent homes. Because again, we're talking about a single point of ignition. We have one house burning, and we have the resources usually to control that fire as a single burning unit. When you're talking about these urban conflagrations and you have thousands of these embers being blown from homes or RVs are large, they're dinner plate size embers. And when you have thousands of these landing below fences or in bushes or on shake roofs or in gutters that have pine needles, and you have dozens or more homes starting to catch fire at a single time, there is no way a structural fire department can fight that fire, because you're then asking a structural fire department to try to fight a wildland fire in an urban area. And that just is not possible. Their primary goal then is evacuating, getting people out of there, because this fire is moving too fast and they don't have the resources to fight dozens of structure fires at a single time.
Yeah, I think this also gets at a really fundamental tension in the fire service, the difference between how firefighters fight wildland fires and how structure firefighters tackle them. I did the basic training for wildland fire myself many years ago. And the thing that surprised me and the difference is that, for structure firefighters, you are working as hard as you possibly can to contain that fire to one unit, one structure. In wildland, the decisions that those firefighters have to make are really much more triage. It isn't all in to stop one home from burning. It's, can we save this home? Often the answer is no. And those firefighters have to walk away, which is why we really encourage people to, limit the types of flammable items around their home, because so often their home in a wildfire context has to stand on its own. It's not safe for firefighters to fight and defend it. And there are quite a few people in the wildland world that think wildland firefighters die when they're defending homes. So, to go back to what you said, you can't fight a wildfire in an urban context. It's basically you're fighting something with like the power and the force of a wildfire with the embers and the multiple things on fire and the hurricane force winds, but you're doing it in an area where there's so much more stuff to burn, very few places to go, and a lot of people that got to get out. Do you think I captured that fairly?
Yeah. Again, I think the biggest difference when you're looking at how to fight these urban conflagrations versus a wildland fire is in a wildland fire, as you said, you are triaging it, you're containing it. There is not the human component of saving people's lives in most cases in a wildland fire. You're trying to protect resources. You're certainly trying to keep it from moving into areas of homes. But in most cases, there's plenty of time to evacuate those people ahead of those wildland fires and get them out of there. Now, when you move into an urban conflagration, your priority is people's lives, right? And so when that priority changes, how you fight those fires changes dramatically, right? Traditional methods of fighting structure fires or wildland fires do not apply in an urban conflagration. You cannot do one or the other and solve this problem. It's a combination of both, and that's why trying to define what this really is important in not only how we manage and try to suppress these things, but how we come up with risk factors and mitigation strategies to try to stop these.
Yeah, and that gets back to the fundamental, as I said, like existential part of this conversation that I wanted to have is so we agree that these aren't wildfires. So why is it important to define them as one thing or the other? Why is it important to define if they're an urban conflagration or a wildfire? And I'm interested also to kind of think about what position this puts us in as community planners and wildfire experts. What we do is we address wildfire risk, and yet we're working with these communities that are facing urban conflagrations. So, as you said, it's changing how things work for firefighters. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how is it changing things for people like us, planners and builders who are thinking about how to reduce the risk.
Yeah. If we view these as wildfires, Ryan, the risk factors for mitigating wildfires, you look at drought, you look at vegetation type and density, weather patterns, things like that. If we use those as the risk factors for mitigating these conflagrations, we're not going to get anywhere because that's not what's causing these in most cases. It can influence these, but these aren't the risk factors that are going to help solve this problem. Urban conflagration risk factors involve things that are in that built environment. Right? We're looking at building materials, building density, infrastructure, things that usually aren't taken into account when we look at solutions for wildland fires. It's kind of a paradigm shift here, and we need to view these as fires in an urban area. And how do we stop these fires from transferring from one structure to another in an urban area? And this is kind of a new science in the last 20 years that we're diving into. How do we build structures that won't burn when the building next to them are burning? And how do we do that in cost effective ways and areas where people need higher density so people can live there? And how do we allow people to have vegetation and fences that they want for aesthetics, but still make them safe in terms of these urban conflagrations? And
Yeah.
so these places that planners are starting to tackle with help from the fire department, the people who know how fires burn, and deciding how do we build in places that are high risk and how do we try to mitigate that while still allowing people to live where they want to live.
I think that's a really good transition to the next part of this conversation where we wanted to talk about what you do to stop them. But before I go there, I just wanted to circle back to a point you made about this paradigm shift. And that reminded me of a community that we've been working with, and we are reviewing their community plan they use to reduce their wildfire risk. This plan is known as the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And the plan ends with a list of actions they're going to take to reduce their wildfire risk. And every single one of their actions was about addressing plants, doing fuels mitigation, as they say in the wildland world, which means effectively thinning and cutting down your trees and making sure there's less stuff for a wildfire to burn. And there was virtually no treatment of the built environment, as we call it. There was no discussion of how your landscaping codes and building construction and homes contribute to your fire risk. And that, I think, sort of shows the paradigm shift we're trying to highlight here that many communities have yet to make, that this is not just about vegetation anymore. It's about your neighborhoods. Your neighborhoods are burning each other down.
Yeah, we see that in so many communities we work in, Ryan, where their comprehensive plans or their community wildfire protection plans talk about the ways to reduce these fires as really a landscaping type mitigation, thinning public lands or open space around communities, maybe touching on the landscaping in the communities a little bit, but they don't really talk about what's causing these communities to burn down. They don't talk about the fences, the area within 5 feet of the home. These structures are actually the most vulnerable part of this. When they start burning, they're produce enough heat, enough embers that is what starts this domino effect of these communities burning down.
Yeah. And that explains why, when you look at maps of neighborhoods that have burned in these major urban conflagrations, you see the homes are gone, but the trees are there, or like the lawn is still green. And I know I've seen lots of news stories about the fires in LA that were sort of like puzzling it, like, how is this row of street trees still alive when all the homes are gone? Hello, everyone. This is Ryan Handy from Headwaters Economics. I want to thank you for listening to our podcast, and I encourage you to share it with your friends, coworkers, and community members. We'd also love to hear from you. If you have any of your own burning questions about wildfire issues in your community, please email them to me at ryan@headwaterseconomics.org. It was interesting to me here as we're talking about how we stop these urban conflagrations. You said earlier that the way we stopped the urban fires of the 19th and early 20th century was thinking about building differently. And that's effectively the answer you're offering now. It is again thinking about building differently and understanding a few key points just to summarize. So homes catch each other on fire, that because of this, if one or two homes decide to address their wildfire risk, it's not good enough. We need like a whole community, a whole block, a whole neighborhood to buy in to these measures. And we know from wildland firefighting that the best chance your home has of surviving is the chance you give it. In an urban conflagration, it may not be safe for firefighters to reach your home. So you need to do your part to protect your home and your neighbors' homes. And that we also know from our research in Headwaters, and we can put a link to this research in the show notes of the podcast, that building to these standards is not substantially more expensive than like a traditional building method that doesn't take them into account.
For us and for people who do what we do, this is one of the hugely frustrating parts of this, because we know the science. We've done this before. Like you said, when we were burning cities down 100 years ago, we made changes and stopped those cities from burning. We know how to keep these communities from burning down. It ends up being kind of two things. It's a social science piece, educating folks that this is not a wildfire problem. This is a different problem. We have the answers for it. We know how to stop them, but it also takes leaders and decision makers with the guts and fortitude to make the right decisions here, to make the tough choices on how we build so we can stop this cycle of burning these communities down. As you said, we know where the communities are that are at risk. We have mapped those. We can call them out, and we have the solutions. We just need to take that tough step of building the right way, allowing planners to do the right thing and make those hard choices so we can stop this cycle of burning communities down and losing homes and people's lives.
So, Doug, you were talking about how the onus of this change is really on our decision makers to think about how we build differently. The thing that I want to highlight here that's challenging is our research shows, though, that this burden of change applies in many more places than we originally thought. It applies in communities that may have never thought about wildfire as a major hazard that they face. And I want to pull out a recent example to kind of illustrate this. Around St. Patrick's Day, there was a wildfire in Stillwater, Oklahoma, which is an urban community with a state university. And the wildfire there destroyed hundreds of homes, the most of any fire in Oklahoma history, right outside of Stillwater. And many of those were in really urban areas. And I was reading about this fire in the New York Times, and there was a paragraph in this news story that really just kind of summarized what's happening here in a really striking way. And I just wanted to read that paragraph really quickly so we could think about it. It says the fires in Oklahoma were fueled by low humidity, dry vegetation, hurricane force winds, creating dystopian landscapes of orange skies, downed utility lines, and homes reduced to piles of sticks, an eerie echo of scenes from Los Angeles just 2 months before. And this is what really strikes me about Stillwater. Technically, the wildfire risk maps at wildfirerisk.org show that Stillwater has high fire danger, but fires there aren't something the community is used to dealing with, especially not on this scale of urban destruction.
Right. Yeah. I think the fires in Oklahoma, Ryan, really kind of highlight that this is not just a Western state's problem. I think historically, people have always thought of wildfires as being something that happened in California or Colorado. And, we know that there's a huge fire risk in areas of the South. New Jersey's had fires, obviously Oklahoma, and we see fires, large fires in Florida and the Carolinas. This is not just a Western state's problem. Anytime you have the perfect storm of conditions, you have the wind, you have low humidity, you can have these fires. And I think in a lot of these places in the South and the East, that is a more challenging problem. Their priorities usually are on hurricanes, on tornadoes, severe winter weather events. That's the hazards they plan for.
Yeah, so I think this brings us back to the existential part of this discussion. So we've mapped some of these communities, and I went through this map that we developed of urban conflagration risk and tried to find some examples of places where I myself did not associate wildfire risk. And some of the communities on that map are Hutchinson, Kansas, Norman, Oklahoma, Auburn, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi, Fort Smith, Arkansas, Sioux City, Iowa. Like Biloxi, when I think about Biloxi, I think about hurricanes and flooding. And this is what feels existential to me. Suddenly, all of these places that typically don't worry much or at all about wildfires now need to be worrying about urban conflagrations.
Yeah, and that list of towns caught me off guard as well, Ryan. I've worked in the South and the East for a lot of years on fire issues, but I mean, Biloxi, Mississippi, crazy. That was never the top of my list for having a high wildfire potential, but it just shows that when the right set of conditions happen and you have vegetation in communities and you have homes that aren't necessarily built to withstand wildfire, this can be, a real problem anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it today. I think somehow amazingly we made it through maybe 30 minutes or so of a podcast with saying urban conflagration and existential multiple times without totally messing it up. We will link in the show notes to our latest research identifying 1,000 or more communities at risk of urban conflagrations. Please take a look, see if your community is one, and if you have questions about what you should do, please reach out to us on the website. Thanks, Doug, so much again for chatting with me about this.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
And join us for our next episode when we will be discussing rebuilding after a wildfire. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Burning Questions, a podcast about wildfire. To see more about our work, visit us at headwaterseconomics.org. This episode was produced by Ryan Handy, Doug Green, and edited by Brent Powell. This podcast is a production of Headwaters Economics. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others. This organization is an equal opportunity provider.